Previously on Inside the Investigation.
While one of those three individuals stayed in the car because he knew that the victim and would recognize him, the other two went in and took turns sexually assaulting and raping the mother in front of her son and robbing them there. There really aren't words for the violence and the aggravated nature of a crime like this. Short of a homicide or physical torture, it's about as bad as it gets.
All right, welcome back to Inside the Investigation, where we're here with Norfolk Commonwealth Attorney Ramin Fatehi. I'm Aesia Toliver, and we're digging into a case of home invasion and rape. So at this point, they've done the sexual assaults. They've stolen set amount of money at this point. They found a little bit more money through ransacking the home. And then do they just leave the victims tied up in the bedroom and hit the road with the getaway driver, Mitchell, or what happens from there?
They leave and then they come back because they realize that they had left a phone in the house. They get the phone and then they leave again. The victims report the crimes to the police. The police begin to investigate. They have some idea of who these men were, and then they tie the case together.
Were they wearing masks? Were they open-faced? Like,
no masks, as far as I understand it. You know, they were visible and they weren't total strangers to the victims. But it still takes the police a certain amount of time to be able to build a case. They can't just go out and arrest somebody because they think the person did it. So and the evidence, the very damning evidence of who was on the phone with whom and where people's phones were connecting to cellular telephone towers was instrumental in getting this case to the point where only one of the three individuals even decided to go to trial. So that's the difference between a quick and sloppy arrest and a very well investigated case like this, where by the time it comes to us as prosecutors, after the police have done their work, it's ready. And we were able to get the case done even without going to trial.
well, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people, out there, the regular person, like you've sat in on a court case, understand that you can get a search warrant for phone records, correct? And
Yes.
then through those phone records and access to the phone, you can then go back in time and see where their cell phone pinged on what day at what time to connect them to a location.
Right. It doesn't necessarily, my phone won't put me in this chair
Right.
if somebody got a search warrant for it for today, but it would put us in the general neighborhood. Then there are other apps on our phone. We always worry about government privacy, but there's private sector. Every time we click through and hit accept and don't read all the fine print,
We're all guilty of that.
Yep, we're all getting tracked a lot more closely than we think. And that information can be available to the government if there's a search warrant and if a judge signs off on the search warrant. So it took some time, but it was still relatively quick by the standards of a violent crime, and it was put together very, very cleanly. And
So
the cleaner the case, the more likely it is to be a plea rather than a trial.
So, this incident happened October of 2021. 2023 is when things started to really wrap up. Ward was ultimately sentenced to 93 years,
That's
right? 73 years, and Mitchell 16, the getaway driver. Both Ward and Wright were just 22 years old when the crime was committed, and now arguably will die behind bars. Talk to me about why you think the judge went on because there's a spectrum of years that they could be sentenced to. Why do you think the judge went to those lengths?
I wouldn't speak for the judge. I wouldn't presume to do that. The judge in this case is one of the best judges I've ever practiced in front of. She is thoughtful. She is careful. She also, in my experience, has very little patience for aggravated violent crimes. And these sentences were well above the advisory sentencing guidelines in these cases because the facts were terrible. We engaged in charge bargaining in these cases. The defendants wanted to try and limit their exposure and sort of be able to throw themselves on the mercy of the court to say that they were accepting responsibility for what they had done. And we got rid of some charges. We got rid of some mandatory minimum time, which, I mean, if you look now, you can see that this is another example of why mandatory minimums are stupid, because the mandatories would have been nowhere close to these numbers.
Right.
So mandatory minimums are irrelevant when you have an aggravated crime. All they do is shackle the judge when there's a reason for the judge to impose a lighter sentence. But we very consciously left the sentencing open with no cap because we wanted to respect the fact that a neutral arbiter, a judge, should be able to hear both the aggravated facts and whatever facts the defendants wanted to offer in their own defense for why they should get a lesser sentence. But, you know, these were on the longer end of the sentences that we've seen in our courthouse over the last few years. And I'm not unmindful of how young these defendants were.
Right.
You know, these were sentences that the judge chose, and we
Right.
respect the judge's right to do it. But one of the things that we've learned about people and about their neural development is that if you're 20 or 22 or 23, and especially if you're a man, you really don't have all of your impulse control abilities. You have more of an ability to govern yourself at the age of 30 than you do at the age of 20. And generally what that means is that we should be seeing slightly shorter sentences for somebody who's 20 than somebody who's 40. That may seem backwards, but it's because the person at 40 has a lot less of a capacity for growth. We also know that people tend to commit violent crimes at a much lower rate after the age of about 40 to 45. It really goes
Do you think
off the
that's
table.
a physical thing? Like they're just weaker, so they're not as...
It's a hormonal thing. The vast majority of violent crimes are committed by men. And, you know, as a former teenager, former teenage boy, let me assure you that my blood's not as hot as it was then. There are times when somebody does something to me now, and I'm 46, and I go, you know, and I go, nah.
Right. You're able to kind of think that through.
Right. And that's just a biological fact. And testosterone and sort of androgens are part of what fuel aggression, and part of what our prefrontal cortex does is try and help us govern that aggression. But we've talked about it, and it's worth mentioning again. We are dealing with extremely aggravated facts.
Yes.
Nobody died, but this was awful. It was terrible. Depraved is not a word that I think is too strong to use. Now, it may not have been pre-planned in the sense that they woke up that morning and decided to rape a man's mother in front of him, but that's what they did. And there has to be some recognition in the sentence that even if you're not going to do this again, the sentence needs to be long.
Right.
So, but that was a sentence that was ultimately the decision of the judge. It was not, we didn't go in there and ask for 93 and 73 years.
You said these are the facts.
Yes.
You make the choice.
Yes.
All right. And we'll be right back. Now we're going to dig a little bit into the past of these suspects and maybe why, if there ever could be an explanation on that. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to Inside the Investigation. We're now talking a little bit, we're shifting, because I like to think that, you know, what people have been through leads to who they are today. You know, the hardships you've been through, the good things, all of it, your parents, how you were raised, forms your opinions on life and who you are. So when you're looking at a case like this, and we did want to just kind of clarify, they were 22 when they were sentenced, but just 18, Ward and Wright, when the crimes were committed. When I was 18, I don't even know if I knew, you know, a quarter of the things I know now. So Ward especially came from a very traumatic household. Like I believe his father was involved in some crime. Can you talk a little bit about what he was exposed to that may have led him to have this, you know, dominance issue, or these, you know, a life of crime at such a young age?
And you're right. We were dealing with people who were 22 and 23 and being judged on their possibility to reoffend, which is only one of the factors.
Right.
You know, the aggravated nature of the cases are another big one. But yeah, we're talking about young guys who were barely adults and you know, had not had their full brain developed. Now, you talked about sort of where we come from,
Mm-hmm.
and the philosopher John Rawls called certain characteristics that we have morally arbitrary characteristics. That means the things that we didn't do, whether you want to think about it in a spiritual way that God gave us, or fate, or the roll of the dice,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're black or white, whether we're men or women, whether you're 5 feet tall or 7 feet tall, whether you're smart or not,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're mentally ill or not. Those are not things that any of us do to deserve per se. They are sort of the cards that we are dealt. And who we turn into as adults has a lot to do with those cards. I'm never going to play center for the New York Knicks. Like, it's just not in the
No.
cards. I tried. Okay, I didn't try, but no, I'm 5'6" tall. That's just not happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not happening. And it's the same thing. I was reviewing a pre-sentence report from 1996 recently for a man who just committed a robbery in his 60s, which is unusual.
Yeah.
And he was tested at a verbal IQ of between 50 and 60 in the 1990s. He can't help that. Now we have to be held criminally responsible for what we do, but we can't help who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And then it is a well-documented fact, and if you speak, for example, to Valerie Slater at Rise for Youth, that what are called adverse childhood experiences, abbreviated ACE, ACE, have a huge bearing on how those cards that you were dealt wind up getting played. If you have significant cognitive deficits but come from a home full of love,
Mm-hmm.
you're never going to be a genius,
Mm-hmm.
but you may have the cognitive tools necessary to the extent that you can develop them
Mm-hmm.
to live and function relatively normally.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have those sorts of cognitive deficits, and you're exposed to everything that we see in a bad childhood, whether it's lead paint, whether it's air pollution, whether it is substandard food, whether it is neglect, whether it is abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional,
Mm-hmm.
all of those things can then make the situation worse. It can tear up certain cards that you have, or force you to play them in a certain way. I have a mentor, the Commonwealth's attorney in Albemarle, a man named Jim Hingley. And Jim always likes to say that hurt people hurt
I was
people.
just about to say that.
Yeah,
I've
Jim.
always been told that.
Yep, Jim didn't make it up, but he
Right.
definitely reminded me of it.
Yeah.
And that is invariably true. When I look at cases where the facts are really horrible, where the defendants have done things that are ghastly, that we just can't imagine ourselves doing, there's invariably an element of mental illness, an element of childhood abuse, physical or sexual, an element of cognitive disability, or some combination of all three.
And in these cases, what did you guys find when it comes to those suspects? Had they themselves gone through any type of assault in their life or anything of that nature that would have led them to move like this?
It's really interesting because we had Mr. Ward on one end of that spectrum, where he had a lot of those deficits and a lot of those disadvantages. And then we had Mr. Mitchell on the other, where he didn't have a lot of those hallmarks. And for better or worse, I think that also played into some of the differences that we would have seen in these sentences. Mr. Ward went through an evaluation for whether he was even mentally competent to stand trial. He was examined, and that doesn't happen just if you have garden variety mental illness. Your lawyer has to worry that you
don't understand what's going on
right,
in the court proceedings.
To the extent that you can't even help your lawyer.
Right.
And it's not constitutional to proceed on somebody if they can't help their lawyer. Ultimately, he was competent. He was able to go forward. But, Mr. Ward had, his father murdered when he was a child. He had diagnosed mental illness. Some of it medicated, some of it not. He had dropped out of school. He had no stable housing. He was going from house to house at the age of 18. So he had both mental illness, he had childhood trauma, he had financial desperation and instability.
Mm-hmm.
So he and his co-defendants were members of a local gang, and gangs often provide structure that is missing in somebody's home
Give you
life.
a family if you don't have one, in a
Right.
way.
The twisted dark side of a
Right.
family. So he had all of the hallmarks of somebody who would lash out and harm other people in the way that he did. He underwent an evaluation that I know that the judge looked at by a mental health professional. That, that's art rather than science. But one of the findings that mental health professional made was that based on his childhood experiences, he was at an above average risk to engage in other acts of sexual violence. And we don't punish people for what they haven't done.
Right.
But at the same time, we do have to consider
The threat to the community.
well, and as best we can with the tools that we have, recognizing that in 20 years it may be considered barbarism and totally wrong. And that's a whole nother subject, is that the system needs to have the ability to recognize that it was wrong, and also to recognize that that somebody is not the same person at the age of 60 that they are at the age of 20. That's what parole is, and which has largely been abolished. But those are systems that are largely absent under Virginia law, and that we need our legislators to be able to put into place. But Mr. Ward was, I mean, you read through his pre-sentence report, we do, and the judge does, and the defense does, and we say this doesn't excuse what he did, but it provides context.
Yeah.
Like I encourage anybody who just thinks that people are born bad to go and think of some of the childhood experiences that people had and say, if I had gone through that, how would I be different as a human being if I didn't have parents who loved me, or if I had experienced all of these other things. We regularly see it. Mr. Mitchell was interesting because he was on the other end.
Let's get into him in just a second, because he was on the complete other spectrum and yet still found himself in a bad situation. All right, we'll be right back. All right, so we are back, and we're going to be talking about Mitchell now. We talked about Ward and, some of the trauma that he had experienced up until that point that could provide some context as to why he did what he did. Mitchell, on the other hand, college student, was back on break, was doing things with his life, had a full ride for, was it football or basketball? Basketball. And man, how quickly his life changed.
He made bad choices, and he's going to spend a chunk of the rest of his life in prison as a result of it. And it goes both ways. Mr. Mitchell should have known better. He had the cognitive tools. He had a stable family. He had a college scholarship. He needed to know better. And this is where it gets into adolescents make stupid decisions. And he's now saddled himself with a criminal record and a double-digit prison sentence. But it cuts both ways. So to the extent that impulse and bad decision making, because going back, remembering that Ward and Wright were 18, he was 19 when they committed these crimes, 19, 20, right on that line. He will be a different person by the time that he comes out after serving a 16-year sentence, and theoretically will be in a position to put his life together. He was also less culpable.
So he knew the victims, and that's where things get icky to me, because while he didn't do any of the physical damage, he knew them. And I feel like when you have a responsibility at that point, because you're connected to them in a way, and it makes it worse than it being strangers. No?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why Mr. Mitchell got a murder level sentence. 16 years to serve is nothing to sneeze at.
Right.
You go to Europe, about as much as they impose on a murder is about 20 years. And 16 is in the range. It's that would have been within the sentencing guidelines for a second-degree murder for somebody with Mr. Mitchell's criminal history. The fact that the judge imposed that kind of time, bearing in mind, by the way, that the procedural history of Mr. Mitchell's case was a little different. He decided to go to trial.
Mm.
Normally, you get a lot more time if you go to trial, but he was a lot less culpable. And I think he wanted to assert his level of culpability. He was in front of a different judge, though not the judge who sentenced Mr. Ward or Mr. Wright. He was in front of a different judge, and his level of culpability was strong for a getaway driver. For a getaway driver, what he did was awful, but he did not rape anybody himself.
Right.
And that makes a difference. It really makes a difference. He was aware of what was going on. He had a part in all of this happening, but the person who does the deed is still putting himself or herself into a different category.
So when you think about, this case and where, how they were raised went wrong, or hanging with the wrong people, when you think about now where we are, case is closed, they're locked up for umpteen years, and who's left to sit with it is the victims, right?
Yes.
Do you all maintain contact with them, provide them resources to kind of deal with something like this? Or, my mind goes to, okay, they've experienced this, one of the victims was younger, the son. Then does that trauma mean he may be, if he doesn't heal correctly, that he may move in a way that could hurt someone in the future? And it's that kind of revolving door.
Yes. That's always the risk. I'm not talking about this
Right.
victim, either of these victims
Right.
in particular. But the risk is that if you're the subject, or if you're on the receiving end of traumatic experiences, it scars you. As much as a broken bone does. It's just harder to see. And there are courses of treatment, but the human mind just doesn't heal the way the human body heals. We offer resources, we offer support. The prosecutors, it's common for us to remain in touch with victims of their families years after crimes are over. We try not to impose. It's better for victims to choose to reach out to us than for us to reach out to them, because we can reopen wounds that they're trying to close
Right.
if we show up at the wrong time. But we try to be present. I've been prosecuting now for 19 years, and I still am in communication with victims from cases from years and years and years ago. And even victims I'm not in touch with. I have photographs of murder victims whose photographs their mothers have given me that I keep, and that I have a file, and sometimes I open and I look at them to remember them. It's part of the weight that we carry.
I was about to say, how do you, I know as a reporter, just sitting in on some of those cases, I've had to go to my therapist and discuss some of the things that I've seen. Dead bodies, dead babies. I mean, the things that I've seen, and I'm not nearly as close to the case as you. How do you cope?
I cherish the life around me. I cherish my wife. I cherish my sons. My sons are elementary schoolers, and I go and I try to make them happy and take joy in their happiness. And I try to be grateful every day. Grateful for my mother and father who loved me and provided for me. Grateful for the fact that God gave me certain physical gifts. Even if I'm not playing for the Knicks, I'll be okay.
I think you're still making a big impact.
I'm doing all right.
Yes.
But it's gratitude. And it's also a recognition that prosecutor wellness and wellness in general for lawyers has become a topic over the course of the last 10, 15 years. Lawyers have one of the highest rates of substance use disorder, of depression, of suicide, of any of the professions. And criminal lawyers and prosecutors and defense lawyers in particular, because of the nasty things that we see. And sort of, in the male-dominated, sort of alpha-dominated world that prosecution traditionally was, anybody who said, like, look, I'm drinking too much because of this, or I can't sleep, like, they didn't want to admit that.
Right.
And we have had to encourage our colleagues to say, It's okay to say that this was really messed up.
Right.
It's okay to say that it's affecting you.
Right.
It's okay to say, you know what, I need a break from child rape cases for a little
And
bit
it doesn't
because
make you a weak person,
No.
you know, especially men. It's like there's a hesitancy to ask for help.
Well, that's right. And, one of the really great things about the last 20 or 30 years is that we've reached parity in the law. So there are as many women graduating from law school as men. But we see offices like prosecutors' offices like mine, where we have, it'll float, over the course of years, but we're essentially at parity, gender parity in terms of our line prosecutors. So, and I think that that diversity helps us in a host of ways, but it also
Right.
helps us in, showing men that that there is nothing wrong with like being emotionally transparent, and in fact makes us better prosecutors, better able to connect with victims. But yeah, we have to be careful because the dark side of it can lure us in and can cause us either to fail to care for ourselves or to become callous and look for life on everything and cause harm by abusing the immense power that we have, either by not turning over exculpatory evidence, by seeking excessive sentences, by saying everybody's a dirtbag and they all need to go to prison. I've seen it all. I know who this guy's going to turn into.
Yeah.
Like, that's another manifestation of the internalization of the trauma, and we all have to be very careful about it.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to wrap up on that note. Thank you so much for sitting down and going through this case. And of course, I appreciate you, and we'll continue to work together in the future. And, I'm glad that we ended on the note of mental health, because that's something I'm a huge advocate for myself. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Inside the Investigation.